name is Belinda, as I mentioned earlier, from Provider Institute. I'm one of the founders and managing directors. I come from a risk management background, human resources, workplace health and safety, and have been able to apply my audit learnings in that space over to the NDIS, and have been working with my co-director, Christine, who'll be able to introduce herself in a moment, for the last 5 years, helping NDIS providers navigate and successfully get through audits. Christine, are you there? I'll hand over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us here today. My name's Christine Dempsey. I'm a co-founder and managing director of Provider Institute of Australia as well. My background is very much NDIS. I've worked in the NDIS in some way, shape or form since it was conceived, and supported many providers with the process of becoming a provider, but also understanding the ongoing compliance requirements that apply to being an NDIS provider, and of course what that means in terms of audit. So we're very excited to be here today and to answer your questions. I'm sure you'll have a lot of them, and we're very excited to work through them with you. Thanks, Bel.
Thank you. Okay, so what will we cover today? I know audits and compliance are usually shudder words, things that we don't look to as our favourite things, but we'll try and take the edge off that for you today. We'll talk about, what are the fundamentals around audits? What is an NDIS audit and why is it important? We'll talk about what does an NDIS audit involve, and in particular then a bit of a focus around what the expectations are from an auditor's point of view. And then near the end, looking at how we can give you some insights to set you up for a successful audit, and be ready for whenever you're scheduled to have your next audit. So with that said, let's get into it. So firstly, what is an NDIS audit? And I'll bring that back to what audits are generally. So the purpose of an audit is really to confirm that an organisation can demonstrate and is meeting a set of particular standards. So they've been in the community sector for a long time, but with the introduction of the NDIS, there's been a particular set of standards that providers need to meet. So with the NDIS practice standards, they've broken that down into 2 types of audits, and that depends on the types of services that you're delivering. If you are delivering lower risk kinds of services, you would fall into what's called a verification audit level. If you are delivering what the NDIS Commission deem as higher risk, then you would be falling into a certification level audit. And I'll go into a bit more detail around what each of those audits involve as well, because at each level there are some differences. And really what you need to be able to demonstrate, or what an auditor is wanting to do, is check that what you say you do is what you actually do. So that is a very important part of audits, understanding that you need to demonstrate what you're physically doing. So why are NDIS audits important? Firstly, if you're wanting to become a registered NDIS provider, then they're mandatory. You will need to go through one of those audit types in order to become a registered NDIS provider. Audits, though, generally are also very good for demonstrating your commitment to quality and safety. And if any of you online or watching today have been through any of the, for example, ISO audits, there's quite a similar approach applied to the NDIS audit space. And you will find that, similarly to an ISO recognition, it shows that there are processes that you have in place to make sure the people receiving your services are getting the highest standard and it's meeting their expectations. And aside from all of that, it also means you have a level of confidence in the processes you have because you've had that checked by an external party. So you know that you, in yourself and your services, they're being delivered at an appropriate level. And then that also gives you credibility as well. So if you have successfully been through your NDIS audit already, then you should be able to demonstrate that proudly to say that I have been through the audit processes, I have my systems in place, my staff do the right things, and we're looking after our participants, and that's been verified, which is why we're considered a registered provider. So there are a few good reasons to do it, aside from the fact that it is just mandatory. So what does that look like in practice? So I'll refer back to as well in a moment, the verification and certification parts, but effectively your audit will involve two parts. The first part is around your documentation, and this is usually where you'll hear all about policies and procedures, processes, forms and documents, because what you need to be able to show is the written steps and processes that your organisation is expected to follow. So you might also hear that called your stage 1 audit, particularly as you're organising an audit under the NDIS. With verification and certification, stage 1 is the only bit you will need under verification. So if you're delivering lower risk services, that documentation part is the only part you will need to provide your auditor. If you are registering under certification, then you would also need to go through stage 2, which is the implementation side of things. So what that means is that the auditor is looking to understand how you follow the documentation, policies, procedures, processes and forms that you've provided them in stage 1. So if you're saying that you've got this amazing paperwork in place, you need to then be able to evidence that you're doing it out in practice. So if this is your incident form, then you obviously need to show where they would have been completed and how you're tracking them as per your policies and procedures in stage 2. Stage 2 is essentially verifying what you do through checking your completed paperwork, but then it's also interactive in terms of interviewing you, sitting down and talking with you to understand how you're approaching things. It also includes interviews with participants, so the people who are receiving your services, they want to understand what their experience is in working with you. And you know, if you've said that when you meet with them, they get a service agreement, a support plan and a handbook, did they actually get that? So they like to hear directly from some of your participants as well. And similarly, staff. So they'll have a chat with a few of your staff as well to make sure that the processes you have in place are being followed and that they know and understand what they need to do in their particular role. So part 1, stage 1, documentation, that's your paperwork. Implementation, stage 2, talking to people, showing evidence and providing examples of where you're doing what you say you will. So once you've completed your documentation side of things, when the auditors move to stage 2 for implementation, now that we've sort of moved through the bulk of COVID requirements, you'll find a lot of that is becoming on-site as opposed to this kind of forum where it's online. So a lot more of those will be scheduled as on-site meetings. And the format of that will usually involve an opening meeting or an introductory meeting. And that is where the auditors will sit with you, introduce each other. I'd recommend having a few key people from your team, depending on the size of the organisations here today. That obviously needs to be relevant to your business. So if you've got yourself and maybe one other manager, that might be all it is, or you may have a slightly bigger leadership team, in which case I'd recommend introducing your key leadership members to your auditor or the people that they'll be chatting with throughout the course of the audit. They will usually then provide you with an outline of what they're going to do, like a bit of a plan, an agenda for the next day or couple of days, or maybe the week, depending on how large your organisation is and how many locations you have. And then from there, you'll move into the audit part. So you'll need to be able to demonstrate your evidence. They will ask you to show them different paperwork. They'll want to also arrange interviews as well. So allow time to facilitate time with the auditors for your staff, and then also with participants. Just keeping in mind with participants as well, it's important that you get consent for that process. So a participant has a choice as to whether or not they'd like to participate in the audit process. So make sure you've got that tidied up before you get into audit. Once the on-site element has completed, you will usually come to what's called a closing meeting. And the purpose of that is really for the auditors to go through what they've observed over the time that they've been with you, any concerns that they may have about things that they've picked up during that time, and give you an insight essentially as to what their final report is going to look like. Once they've concluded the on-site element, you'll then effectively receive a report related to that. And I'll talk in a moment as well about anything that they found that's non-conforming. So essentially the next stage is then you're getting that report side of things. And once we've closed off the report side of things, the auditors then send that to the NDIS Commission for their final approval. So I guess just to be clear, the auditors have one process, and that's to go through and do all of that checking, but it's still the NDIS Commission that has the final say once they've reviewed your audit report and done their own checks to determine whether they are going to approve you as a registered provider. And I'm sure there will be questions around how long does that take. So I guess just as a quick snapshot, so once you get your audit locked in, you need to work with your auditors in terms of timeframes and their availability. So it could take, you know, a couple of months, up to 3 months, depending on what their schedule's like and your schedule to get through documentation and implementation. Once that audit report has been sent off, the Commission can take six to 12 months. We are hearing that it can be a little bit longer for them to then make their determination. So I know there is a bit of frustration around that. Unfortunately, that's the scope that we have to work within at the moment. In terms of the timing of your audits, so you've got your initial audit, your initial registration audit that you would undergo, and that can be at whatever point you determine. So if you're ready to get going, you can start looking into that audit process from tomorrow, depending on how organised you are. From there, they then move into set timeframes. So once you have completed your initial registration audit, and that's been successful, you'll then be expected to undergo what's called a midterm audit, and that will occur 18 months after. And then once that's been successfully completed, you'll then need to undergo a recertification audit 18 months after that. So your total cycle is a 3-year cycle. So just to clarify the difference between those audits, so your initial registration audit will cover all of the NDIS practice standards that relate to the services that you're delivering. And similarly with your recertification audit, it will cover all of the standards you're expected to meet as a provider. Your midterm audit is a condensed audit, I guess, a shorter audit, and they're really looking at your operational and governance standards. So there's a strong focus around making sure as a provider, you're following your due diligence processes in terms of managing your business. And they may also, they will also want to check on anything that came up in your previous audit. So if you've got any non-conformances that were identified in your initial audit, then they'll want to see that they have been resolved and addressed, so they're not coming up as an ongoing issue. So another common question that I get asked then at the end of all of that is, can I fail? So technically, the upshot is yes, you can fail from a technical point of view, in the sense that if an auditor identifies there is a serious risk to health and safety, then like anybody else, they have an obligation to report that to the Commission, and it could impact your registration process. However, I would say that in the majority of cases, you have an opportunity to address anything that an auditor finds when they're out on site. So for the most part, you won't fail. You have an opportunity to fix up anything that's been identified. But I have to caveat that if there is a serious risk, then yes, it can impact your registration and your audit outcome. So what does it look like if you're going through audit and you do receive a non-conformance? Firstly, I'd like to put you a little bit at ease that it's not uncommon for non-conformities to come up. It's what is important though is how you're addressing them when they are found. So if you can consider that an auditor is coming in, they have a role to be able to assess what your business is doing at that time, but effectively they're also like an external set of eyes. They're a third party that can come and look at things differently because they're not in amongst things in the day-to-day like you are. You know, they're not coming in to find fault with every single thing you're doing and try and shut you down. That is not the primary purpose of an auditor. It's very rare that that would happen, and if it does, in which case I would recommend going back to your auditing company if you've had that experience. But it's about being able to take on board their feedback, because ultimately you do need to be meeting that standard, and then putting in some practices that mean that's not going to create a bigger issue for you down the track. So yes, non-conformances can occur, and then they are then categorized into two categories. Major non-conformances are quite serious matters. They need to be addressed in a short time frame to make sure you are compliant with the standards. And then there may be some minor findings as well. So something that's not as critical in terms of the risk to health and safety, but needs to be addressed. And they would ideally like to see that you know, closed off and actioned prior to the next audit. So if any non-conformities are identified during your audit, when I was talking about that report process before, you would generally receive what's called a corrective action plan. And what that means is the auditors are asking you to identify what the cause of that was. So why was that a non-conforming situation? And therefore, how will it be fixed? So what are you going to do about it? And then who's going to do it? So it's important that you nominate somebody who can go in and address that matter and fix it, and a nominated due date. Again, depending on major or minor might determine how quickly you need to get onto those things, but at the very least, you need to nominate what your proposed plan is to fix that. And then the auditor will need to review that and be satisfied that those actions will address the non-conformities they've picked up, and approve that. So that is the process in terms of non-conformances that may be picked up. So what are the auditor's expectations? I guess I'd firstly like to point out that auditors are human like the rest of us as well. And so generally it's about having an engaging conversation about the standards and what your business is doing. What they want to know, though, above all else, is that you understand what the requirements are in terms of being an NDIS provider, and that you're meeting the standards and that you're implementing those. So being confident, they want to have a level of confidence that you are doing the right things, and they get that sense in talking with you. The other part, I know it can be quite stressful under an audit process. You've got questions that are being asked of you. You're not quite sure what they might necessarily be. So as much as you can do beforehand, be prepared. So, you would be expecting that you may have to demonstrate some participant files. If you can have them ready and organised, it will make that audit process much more efficient for both of you. So as much as you can sort of be prepared and across where all of your documentation is, what all your processes are, not only will it facilitate a smoother audit process, but it also gives another level of confidence to the auditor, right? If you're sitting there going, oh, actually, where did I save that? I'm not sure where I put that. Hang on, I'll just have to get that. You sort of begin to wonder, well, do they really have everything together as well as I thought they did? So the more you can be prepared, the better it'll work for both sides. And it's really around working together as well. So their role is to make sure that you have everything in place, and your role is to provide the evidence and demonstrate how you're meeting those expectations. So if they're asking for certain documentation, provide it to them so that they can have a look. If there's things that you don't have, I know there tends to be a natural reaction to say, oh, don't tell them that, or, oh, we better create something. I'd say that answering the questions honestly, in terms of, actually, we don't have that yet, but we've got a plan to get that in place, and we'll have that organised in the next month or so. It may not change the fact that you're getting a non-conformance, but it could certainly help to reduce the level of non-conformance. So it might bring it from a major to a minor, but it also means that there's a genuine conversation that's going on. And ultimately, we're all working towards making sure participants have a good service outcome. So the more we can talk about what the processes are and how we can improve them, work well from an auditor's point of view. And the other part of that would be to facilitate the interviews. So, if there's any intent to try and delay interviews because you're worried about what a person might say, that can tend to draw out an audit process. The more you can just facilitate those conversations, the easier that process will be. And the reality is an auditor needs to speak to them anyway. So, if they're not available on the day, when is the next available time that you can facilitate a conversation for them? So, what are my tips for getting through an audit? So, I guess probably it's a few things to be aware of are what are the key reasons that we see organisations can fail audits or don't do very well. So coming back to what I mentioned around auditors' expectations, there's a lack of understanding of the requirements. You're not prepared for the questions that they're going to ask you around the practice standards. And can I just say quickly, with the NDIS practice standards, there isn't a magic checklist somewhere. So all of the questions that you're being asked to answer are about the NDIS practice standards. So the indicators and outcomes are those practice standards. That's what you need to be prepared for. So having a good understanding of that is really important. Another area that can cause an issue is a mismatch between your documents and what's happening in practice. So when we talked about stage one, if you think about stage one, and I was talking about all of the paperwork that you need to have in place, policies, procedures, forms, and documents, they might look A1, perfect, meet all of the standards, brilliant, love it, tick. But then when you get down into practice, and they're just things that sit in your SharePoint, sit on a shelf, no one's seen them, that will undo all of that, great stuff you've seen in part one because no one's actually implementing anything. So it's really important that what is stated in your policies and procedures, your manual, whatever those, structures are, you need to be actually follow them be following them in practice. So what I would say to that quickly is that if you've got policies and procedures and they don't match what's happening in practice, you either need to adjust your policies and procedures so that they reflect what your workforce is doing or what your actual processes are so that they're aligned. Or if it is that your workforce aren't doing what they need to be doing to meet the standards, then potentially need to provide some more information, training and coaching to make sure they are following the processes that you have documented. So making sure that there is no mismatch or as little mismatch as possible between your documentation and what's happening out on the ground. The third area that I see, and I appreciate lots of people have lots of things they need to get through on their to-do list, and it's like you cross one off and add 3. But if there's no documentation, it's effectively like it didn't happen. So if you're holding meetings, make sure there is some time allocated to note down what was discussed and what decisions were made, what was covered. Make sure if an incident is reported, you don't just phone it through to the office and then there's no documented evidence of it. You have to be able to show the auditors what your paperwork is to substantiate what you're discussing. So that is an area that you need to be mindful of. Okay, so what are the things that Christine and I commonly see coming through from providers who have been through audit? So here's a few insights, I guess, is to the common areas. So firstly, in terms of governance, this is really coming back to that midterm audit as well. So I guess depending on the size of your organisation as well, if, for example, you've got management meetings that are happening and you're making decisions about the business, where are they documented? Not everybody has that documented very well. And so then it's not clear how decisions are made. There will also be providers, and this is also going to come down to that reasonable and proportionate, which I'll talk about in a minute, who may be just a sole provider. And so you'll be saying, well, I don't have a management team. It's just me. So with governance, so under the NDIS practice standards, there needs to be a way to demonstrate that your services are going to be around for the long haul. And as part of that, they want to see that there is time allocated to looking at your business overall. So while you may not have a management meeting to sit down and talk about that once a fortnight, once a month, once a quarter, whatever that looks like for those larger organizations, as a sole provider, do you take time out of your day-to-day to sit down, even if it's once a quarter, and think about the bigger picture of your organization? And I know that can feel hard when you've got lots of things coming through on your to-do list, but it's really important to, pick Friday afternoon or, a day in the week that you're going to allocate to that, whether it's once a month or once a quarter, whatever that looks like for you, where you sit down and you process the bigger picture of your organisation. How are we going in terms of staffing? How are we going in terms of feedback and complaints? How are we going in terms of incidents? What are our finances looking like? What are my strategic goals? Am I tracking towards them? Having a look at that bigger picture and then documenting that somewhere. So you're obviously not going to have like a big list of all these attendees because it's you, yourself and I, but noting down somewhere, well, what are the things that you considered at that point in time and any decisions you'd made about that? And you might, for example, print off a couple of reports at that point in time that you potentially reviewed or reflected on in terms of making those decisions. So that's one area that we see that comes up quite a lot, and particularly for our smaller providers. The next area is risk management, which for many people, they cringe and I get excited. That's my favorite space. But I guess what I've observed over time is that there has been a lot of focus on risk management on the participant side of things. So you've got your initial risk assessments, ongoing reviews and things like that, which is excellent. What often gets missed though is how that translates to staff risks, and what are you doing to make sure that your staff are going to be safe doing that job. So I absolutely appreciate that your participants, your clients, are your primary concern in terms of making sure that they are safe and well looked after, but this can't be at the cost of your staff. So you need to be able to find a balance there. And so what that means is if, for example, you're doing a risk assessment for your participants, you also need to consider, well, what risks does that bring to my staff and how am I going to address that? The third element of risk management is around your organizational risks. So it's important to have sat down and worked out an organizational risk assessment. What are the things that can impact your business? And the auditors will want to see each of those elements covered under risk management. So I've done a few workshops looking at risk assessments in this space as a direct result of audit outcomes. The third area is internal audits. So you're probably starting to hear more about the internal audit process now that there's a bit more maturity in the sector, and having been working with the standards for a little while. What the auditors are looking for there is that you've got ways to check that what your systems and processes are saying are aligned with what's happening in practice for yourself. So, you know, you want to make sure that you've been able to check off on having, you know, participant support plans, service agreements, risk assessments, case notes, everything that you need for participants is happening as per your documentation between your scheduled audits. And the reason that's important is because if something is going off the rails, you want to be able to pick up on that fairly quickly. You know, the amount of extra pressure and stress that can be created because you're not looking at something until a month before your audit could very much be avoided by having a organised, coordinated internal audit program. And not only that, it's an expectation of the NDIS practice standards. So they want to see that you have got a process for managing your internal audits. Coming back to reasonable and proportionate. So I guess I just wanted to highlight there that, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a really big organisation or a sole trader, the standards read the same. So you'll need to think about how do you apply that in your business relevant to the number of people in that business that you have and you support. So a bit like the example with the management meetings, if you're an organisation that's got a board in place, a large management team, you'd see some comprehensively documented management meeting minutes. As a sole trader, obviously you're not going to have that, you know, same level of reporting in that way, but you do need to document something. So it needs to be relevant and proportionate to what you are doing. Okay, so what are my top 3 tips to success? Firstly, start early, please. And by early, I literally mean once your last audit is done, try and maintain the pace. Make sure that you're keeping on top of whatever those processes that you have put in to pass that audit. Stay active. And quite often I know people be like, oh, thank goodness that's over. I never want to look at it again until my next audit schedule. That is probably the worst thing you can do. So really utilize your internal audit program to try and make sure that you're keeping on top of those processes. And ideally, you want to get to a point where you know those processes are happening. It becomes part of the way you do things. So that way you could literally have an auditor come on site at any time and it won't matter, because you will have everything in order and working as close to perfect, or, you know, as close to the process as it's meant to. So please give yourself enough time to get ready and then maintain things after you've been through your audit. If we have any providers on here who haven't been through registration before, and this is your first time going through audit, I'd highly recommend getting the maximum value out of the self-assessment. So as I'd said earlier, your self-assessment is based on the NDIS practice standards. When your audit is coming out on site, it's the same questions. So, you know, anything that you've answered in that self-assessment, they're effectively wanting to understand what your knowledge and comprehension of that is. So they'll be asking questions around those same standards. So I highly encourage you to maximize your time understanding those particular questions. Anybody who is going through a renewal process, again, I'm just going to come back to the internal audit process because it can add so much value to what you're doing in terms of being across your processes. So that way, when your next audit comes up, you already know that you've undertaken those processes and your documentation aligns with what's happening in practice. It also means that when they're coming back to do their next audit, they are going to want to address your previous non-conformities. So I highly recommend that any non-conformities, major, minor, or otherwise, pardon me, even if they're observations that the auditor maybe has provided you when they were on site, make sure that you have addressed them, because you don't want that to come up again in your next audit, because whatever your corrective action plan is obviously hasn't been effective and it's come back as an ongoing issue. So please ensure that any non-conformances from a previous audit have been addressed and are no longer an issue. My final tip is to utilize your continuous improvement plan or register, or whatever that looks like for your organization. I can appreciate that there are the best of intentions to get a whole bunch of work done, but things come up, situations arise, and it takes your attention to something different. And it means that your grand plans to complete that risk assessment maybe didn't happen. This is where your continuous improvement plan is your best friend. Anything that you intend to complete for the audit, put it into your continuous improvement plan. Set who's going to be doing the work and a proposed due date, like your planned due date. And then if anything comes up and you can't get to it, at least you can say to your auditor, yes, I know I needed to get that risk assessment done. I've been able to start the first few assessments. Haven't been able to get back to that. I have got it in my continuous improvement plan. This is who's going to be doing it. And that is when it's going to be done by. Again, it may not totally negate your non-conformance, but it may take something down from a major to a minor. Again, depending on what the non-conformance is. But that continuous improvement plan is a very good way to demonstrate you at least know what your obligations are, know what the standards are and what you're meant to be doing, and you've at least got a plan to be able to get to that. And I guess the other little bit to that is if you've got a continuous improvement plan and you have genuine continuous improvement activities that have been picked up in different ways, your continuous improvement plan doesn't have to be everything complete at that given moment in time. Ideally, you kind of want to see all the different works in progress. So, you know, if you've had some incident or some feedback that's come in 2 weeks before audit, and the reality is it's a process that would normally be resolved within the next month or two, put that in there so they can see the work in progress. So yes, again, that's also coming down to that honesty part of things as well. This is how we're actively managing our business, and these are our plans on how we're going to get through everything. Okay, so all that said and done, we've sort of experienced in our time as well, working with providers. I guess as a thank you for today, I wanted to provide an offer for all of the providers watching our webinar today or the replay later. So our membership is around ongoing compliance. So understanding what the expectations are coming into audit and how do you apply that in practice. And we do that through our Provider Institute membership with our Watch, Read, Do program and monthly digests. So aside from a whole range of end of financial year sales that you can find on our website, I did want to offer an extra $100 off our all access membership for anyone coming through this Shift Care webinar. It also means that if you need some assistance with policies and procedures, you'll be able to access a whole range of those which are compliant with the standards. If you do need some support with registration, we can also assist you with that through registration packages. I know there are a number of providers who deliver home care services in the aged care space as well, so we have that available. Supporting forms and documents, a whole library of those, the monthly compliance digests, and priority support desk access. So, you know, if you have questions that come up during audit and you're a bit stuck, you can contact myself, Christine, and our team at any time to ask your questions, and we can provide our advice on how to navigate that and assist. So yes, if you'd like to take advantage of that, the code that you'll need to enter there is ShiftCare XPIA. And I guess, yeah, just to provide some round out of our other services, if you do need assistance with audit preparation or getting ready, you can contact us and we can assist you with that. Registration and renewal support. If you need dedicated time with us for specific consulting advice, then you can also do that as you need through my PIA hours. So I guess from here, I'm really handing back to Andrew and Asha from Shift Care, and yeah, going through any questions that may have come up during the course of our webinar. And thank you for attending.
Hi, Belinda. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. There's quite a lot of questions in here.
Okay.
that have come through. So
right.
I'm not sure. These were probably made in as you're going through the webinar, so they might not be in order. So Faylene's asked if an organisation has ISO accreditation, can this be relied upon for NDIS audit rather than doing a separate NDIS audit?
Okay, so that is a very good question. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to transfer the accreditation across. You will still need to undergo your NDIS audit. However, I would say that depending on your auditing body, if they do accreditation for both, you may be able to streamline those two audits at the same time. The other thing I would say is that if you have ISO accreditation already, the NDIS practice standards follow a very similar model and process. So hopefully it means you'll be able to streamline a lot of that in terms of getting ready for your NDIS audit.
Fantastic. Thank you. Anastella has asked, they'd like to register as NDIS, but they're asking her to pay $4,000 just to register. Is there any other way to register without paying that much?
I'm happy to answer that one.
Unfortunately, that's really going to come down to what services you're wanting to register for, because that will really determine your audit scope and cost. The only other suggestion I would have is to go and get a few different quotes from different auditors. So I think there's something like 22 approved auditing bodies now. So I guess, yeah, just to be clear, Provider Institute isn't an approved auditing body. We provide the advice in terms of meeting that standard, but there are approved auditors on the NDIS Commission's website, and you'd be welcome to contact any of those for a quote, and then you'll be able to see, you know, who's got sort of the most competitive quote if budget is your issue.
Right. Christine, I know you've had a look at some of the questions. Are there any in there that particularly you want to answer?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, just to add to that one, I think it's important to clarify that there are no costs to put an initial registration application or to interact with the NDIS Commission. The costs do come in at the audit point. And I'll kind of going to answer a few of the questions that have come through, because there were a few that were quite similar. So in answer to another question, yes, providers are required to pay for audits, and that may be where that $4,000 figure has come from if you've received a quote for a particular audit. But as Belinda has said, definitely have a shop around, talk to different auditing bodies, and find a audit approach and a cost that suits you. In terms of the ongoing audit cost, as I said, yes, you need to pay for each of your audits. And as Belinda touched on earlier in the session, it is a process of a cyclical set of audits. So every 3 years, you'll need to be undergoing a certification or a recertification audit, with a midterm audit at the 18-month mark in between. And that does continue. In order to maintain your registration, you'll essentially need to be doing an audit every 18 months. Your bigger recertification audit at 3 years, and your smaller scope midterm at the 18-month mark. Someone else also asked when that 18-month timeframe kicks in, and it kicks in from when you get approved. So you'll receive, once you get that initial registration approval, you'll receive your registration certificate from the NDIS Commission, and that will actually set out the timeframe for your registration. And from there you can work out, okay, there's my 18 months, there's my 3-year timeframe for audit. The other thing to do in that space as well is to keep in touch with your auditor. Ideally, it'd be great to get into a relationship with the one auditing body that can get to know you really well, that you have a relationship with, and they can be in contact with you as well as you're leading into 18-month or 3-year audit timeframes, to kind of give you a reminder, see where you're at, book in your audit time for the time that's suitable to make sure you meet your timeframe requirements. So I think I answered a few questions there, but there are just a lot of similarities across some of those. So
wonderful, thanks, Christine. Annalise has asked, they have NDIS staff prepared and ready, but with clients, I'm still in the preliminary stages of getting their plan reviewed or helping them to get on the NDIS. How does that affect my second part of the initial audit, having passed the first one?
Okay, so I'm guessing they're talking about having gone through stage 1 and then moving into stage 2 with the implementation side of things. Essentially, if you've not got any participants that you're currently supporting who are NDIS approved, what an auditor will want to understand is, what will that process look like when you are actively working with them? So again, it'll be coming back to your documented processes as well. Okay, well, we'd be meeting with them. We'd be going through a service agreement, explaining their rights, providing them a handbook with all of our processes, working together to agree a support plan, undertaking a risk assessment, and then going through and working out who an appropriate staff member would be to provide those services. So if you don't have participants actively working with you at the time of audit, the auditor will want to understand that you know what you're going to do when they come to you.
Can I just jump in there as well, just to note that with that process, if you don't yet have participants for that first registration audit, what they'll do is give you a provisional certification. So if you've got participants and they can actually validate the way that the services are being provided by interviewing participants and looking at participant files, you'll receive, I guess, full accreditation. But without participants, you'll receive a provisional accreditation. And once you get to your next audit, so your 18-month midterm audit, when hopefully you have participants, they can then validate the participant experience and shift your registration from a provisional certification to full certification.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christine. Elwyn's asked a question: can staff report you for operational management and governance issues? Say your practice violates worker ethics, for example, and unprofessionalism. Can the workers report you?
Look, anyone can report a provider who is not doing the right things. I guess it really depends on what the worker issues are. Couple of things is, if you're undergoing your NDIS audit, and their processes that aren't followed, then staff, yes, can potentially talk about that with the auditor. So that would be picked up through that process, in which case you'd be potentially looking at a non-conformance. A staff member, yes, can make a report to the NDIS Commission if there is a risk to health and safety as well, like any other person. And probably the only other thing I would flag is that staff still have entitlements with Fair Work Australia as well. So I know that's not necessarily a governance matter per se, but in terms of your human resources processes and how you work with and engage with your staff, still need to meet Fair Work requirements. So there is always an avenue for them to report there too.
Wonderful. Thanks, Belinda. Manish has asked, what are the WHS documents auditors will be looking at and providers would need to have in place?
From a staffing perspective, I'm expecting they're talking about. I'll go with that assumption anyway. So from a workplace point of view, remember that each state has its own workplace health and safety legislation. So the expectation is, as a provider, that you would be meeting those requirements. So I would highly recommend having a documented risk assessment that talks about your staffing risks and how you are addressing those.
And I guess just from a policy and procedure perspective, having an overarching policy and procedure around work health and safety, covering off all your different risks to staff, but also considering quite importantly, I think, where you've got staff working in participants' homes become a workplace. So if you are delivering a model where you're in participants' homes or in the community, those locations become a workplace. So it's important to make sure that your work health and safety policy and procedure kind of covers those types of scenarios as well. And probably also workplace incident management. How do you address and respond to incidents that happen to staff? There's a lot of focus, obviously, from the participant perspective on managing participant-related incidents, but you should have a separate dedicated policy and procedure and processes around managing staff incidents as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine. Jeff has asked, can a registered provider provide support coordination and/or direct support workers to staff members or their families?
I would say that's a huge conflict of interest, and the answer would be no. I have heard of some very limited examples of where that has happened, but it has been with approval from the NDIA and or the NDIS Commission, where there might have been issues of inability to find other suitable providers, things like that. But short answer would be no. It's a huge conflict of interest, lots of risks associated with that type of approach.
Thanks, Christine. Sarah's asked, what would be the reasons as to the delay in a renewal of registration for an NDIS provider?
Do they mean delay in the timing of their renewal or delay in the approval by the Commission?
Hasn't mentioned, Christine, unfortunately.
Yeah, look, I know certainly you've obviously got the timeframes that you have to adhere to around the 18 months and the 3 years. I do know that you can work with your auditor to request extensions in extenuating circumstances. In terms of the NDIS Commission's approval of renewals, again, as Belinda touched on earlier, no one has any power over the Commission in terms of its timeframes for approval. I guess the one bonus if it's a renewal process is that you'll already have been registered, and so the expectation is that you can continue to operate while you're waiting for the outcome of your renewal decision. Whereas obviously if you're waiting for your initial registration, you've got to wait for that period before you get the decision from the Commission. But yeah, the Commission just has its own, I guess, extenuating circumstances in terms of staffing and things like that just mean they do take quite a while to get through the approval process once auditors have put the reports up.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine. Bob's asked in a couple of different questions. We are registered for SDA and we have a condition on our verification that we have a stage 2 audit within 6 months,
Mm.
and then another one at 18 months and 3 years. Does that sound correct?
I have heard of that happening before, and I don't think it's that you're being singled out. It may be more that from my understanding, they seem to be maybe starting to focus in on SDA providers in particular, and wanting to get a bit more assurance sooner than the 18-month audit of your ability to support participants. SDA is quite unique in that, particularly if you're going through if you said verification, Bob, it sounds like you're probably delivering just SDA. So that's still certification, but it is a more compressed process, I suppose. It's a smaller scope certification process where you only have to comply with the 5 SDA standards. So I have heard of instances where providers who are just delivering SDA are being requested to have an earlier audit. And I guess it's just because the Commission wants to check up on what it looks like for you once you're actually delivering services. SDA is traditionally seen as, I guess, a little bit more of a hands-off service because it's about building and providing the bricks and mortar, specialist homes for people with disability. But the standards actually do have quite a focus on participant support and participant safety and well-being. So, yeah, I think the Commission is probably starting to focus a little bit in on SDA providers who are delivering just SDA to say, okay, just once you've got people in the house, you've got the house built, you've got the house enrolled with the Commission, you've got people moving in. Once that happens, what does the service delivery look like?
Oh, thank you so much for that, Christine. Well, we've just hit 1 o'clock, so we need to wrap up. I know there's a few more questions. So Belinda and Christine, we might come together after this and try and get those answered for those people that we couldn't get to. And we'll also be sending out a recording. So if you need to rewatch it, we'll send that out shortly as well. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. And Belinda and Christine, tons of useful info. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.